One of the biggest myths of the Palestine-Israeli war is that it has been going for centuries, but why? Well, we would have to go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, where when the Palestine region and most of the Middle East were under the control of the Ottoman Empire. By that time, Muslims, Christians, and a small number of Jews lived together in peace and harmony, but the Muslims had an idea to form a country called Palestine, and the Jewish were building an idea of Zionism not too far away in Europe. This meant they didn't only want to be a religion, but a civilization. At that time, the idea of Zionism was only at its early stages, but it quickly became popular in the early 1900s. This meant that tens of thousands of Jews went and lived in the Palestine region each year, which was a concern for the Arabs who were already in that region, as they saw them as a threat to the area they wanted to establish. People like Theodor Herzl were a big figure in this movement, even though he passed away early on in this movement. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, leading the French and the British to take over the region, and the British were the ones who took over the Palestine region. The growing number of Jews were also concerning the British as well as the Arabs, so the British limited the number of Jewish travelers, which led the Jewish people in the Palestine region to do acts of violence to both of their threats. By the year 1933, Hitler rose to power and took with him the idea that the Jews should be expelled from the earth. Many years went by, and propaganda was really against the Jewish minority of the population. And so many of the normal citizens had this idea that the Jews were not very nice, even though most of them rarely met one. This was a big problem in the Jewish community, and it was even bigger when the Holocaust broke out during the Second World War. Nearly 6 million Jews died in this act, and they had to flee the area from the massacre. So many of the Jews fled to the state of Palestine, where many Jews had already settled beforehand. This led many tensions between the different groups in the area, not just between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jewish settlers, but the Middle Eastern countries were involved, as they saw this as just another act from the Europeans to colonize the area. This, though, did not stop the Jewish from establishing their own country, and by the 14th of May 1948, only 4 days after the British Empire left the Jews established their country named Israel. At the time, U.S. President Harry Truman recognized the country's state at the same day. There were many disputes in the area, and they were alarmingly growing, so the British Army left the area due to the acts of violence in the area. Note that they left before Israel was established. The West Bank of the area of Palestine was left for Jordan, and the Gaza Strip was taken by the Egyptians. In October 29, 1956, the first was between Israel and some of the Arab countries, including Egypt and Syria. This led to Israel taking the Sinai Peninsula, and we're within 10 miles of the Suez Canal, which is 16 kilometers. Many wars followed, but by the 6th of October 1973, Egypt took back a portion of the Sinai Peninsula through war, but notice I only said a portion. Egypt took back its land through stages from Israel, but in return that had to do a favor, which was to recognize Israel as a country, which they did in January of 1980 in Washington, D.C. between the Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat and the Israeli President Yitzhak in the presence of the American President Jimmy Carter. Many other Middle Eastern countries followed on after Egypt's recognition to Israel, even if some of them didn't recognize Israel formally till this day. The aftermath of the war led to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to become their own independent country, even though Palestine is not part of the United Nations. Many of their lands were taken over through the time by Israel, and they are continuing to do so, supported by the United States and most of Europe.